Thank you. Yeah, so as mentioned, I am covering managing the people who manage the machines. And, oh, there's my clicker. I'm not anti-generative AI. I'm not anti-technology. What I am is someone who is very mindful of, at the end of the day, there are people managing these technologies, especially as we start to get into systems like generative AI that start to create this divide between those who can and those who can't. And I'm more so in the field of those who can't. I'm not a technologist, but I've spent my entire career managing technologists. So as we get into it, as I like to say to my friends, let me take you on a journey. Let me tell you a story. So let's pretend you are sitting at your desk, minding your own business, doing your work, and your boss comes to you and says, generative AI, we got to do the thing. We need to include it in our annual planning. We need to figure out how to stay competitive. We got to do the thing. Go figure it out. And you're like, cool. I have no idea what that means. Let me go ask my resident smart person, sometimes known as Alan. So you say, hey, resident smart person, we need to know what large language models are. We need to know what generative AI is. And your person says to you, the epiphany of large language models, distinguished by their profound deep neural architecture and expansive parameterization, constitutes a quantum leap in domain marketing. And then they keep talking, and then your eyes roll into the back of your head, and then you say, I have no idea what just happened. Ooh, that's not a helpful answer. So you know what you say? Can you dumb it down for me? And you know what they do? They dumb it down for you. Looks like you're having trouble grasping the basics. Let me break it down for you like you're a little kid. Large language models are super duper smart tools that help us know what our customers like. They're way better than the old stuff we used to use. And then they continue to say condescending things to you. They continue to mansplain to you. They continue to make you feel wonderful about your expertise and all of the experience that you have in the world. And you say, cool. I feel really good about this conversation. I'm having a very professional response to everything that you just said. I'm going to go about my day. You're probably wondering, why couldn't you just Google this, or why couldn't you just ask a large language model what it is? And the reason is because the answers are going to be specific to you. So you can get general information from an internet search. You can get general information from a system like ChatGPT, but you can't get something tailored. And what I want to be able to do today is, I can't teach you everything about managing people and communication, but what I can give you is some tips and tricks on how to approach the conversation to make it be more productive. So for example, where did the first one go wrong? Well, very straightforward. You start to, when you have your managers tend to approach things as too bossy. We assume we aren't smart enough to have the conversation. We ask the wrong questions. This is the core issue. We're asking the wrong questions of the people we need the answers from. We overcompensate because we get into a conversation with someone that we deem smarter than us, and we feel intimidated, so we tend to do the other things like act too bossy. We tend to have a bad attitude, and then when we don't get the answers that we're looking for, we blame the technologist. Oh, well, my resident smart person didn't give me the answer that I need, so therefore, they just didn't understand, so it didn't work. On the flip side, if you think about your technologists, they come across as too bossy. They assume that we aren't smart enough to talk to them. They have poor communication. They also overcompensate by throwing in 8-syllable words to try to trip you up and make you feel like you aren't smart enough to talk to them. They have a bad attitude, and then they blame the managers for not communicating the information correctly. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but it's the same problem on both sides. We are both sides of the conversation struggling to talk to each other. And as we introduce even more technology, those barriers between the two sides is just going to become thicker and bigger and greater. And so this is the time when you want to really focus on, how do I best communicate? How do I have a conversation? And it seems like it should be straightforward, but there's a lot of reasons why it's not. Number one, people are difficult. It's reasons why a lot of us turn to technology like generative AI. We're there for Andrew's opening remarks. You could see he was interacting with the machine. He wasn't talking to a person, but you still need to know how to talk to the people. Some of the worst possible things you can do is say, can you dumb it down for me? Tell me like I'm stupid. Tell me like I'm 5. That's way over my head. You're too smart. The reason why these are not great statements, and you would never want to say them to a generative AI system either, is because you are giving the other person permission to then treat you that way. So if you take nothing else, if you are struggling to communicate with someone who is explaining to you this more technical thing, just don't use those phrases. I will give you the tips and tricks to learn what to say instead. So, what we don't want is we don't want to feel at the end of the day like the person that we're talking to is treating us like we're an idiot. We want to feel like we can have a conversation with someone, or we can approach a generative AI system and feel like we're getting something out of it, but mostly we need to learn how to talk to each other. So if I take a step back for a second, this is tiny itty-bitty little Katie. 20 years ago, when she started her first growing-up job, she knew nothing about communication, absolutely nothing. She was hot-headed, she was very short-tempered, and pretty much terrible at her job, which was ironic because she was hired to be the central point of communication. So I sat in between software stakeholders, the data team, the sales team, the marketing team, and the research and development team. There were a lot of issues that I walked into, but I did not help fix these issues. I actually would perpetuate a lot of them without knowing it. So one of the main issues that we had was that we had our stakeholders who were academics. These academics were then responsible for making decisions about the products that we were developing on behalf of the customers. Primarily, one of our stakeholders, who we used to call the N of 1, he would show up at the software meetings, he would show up at the sprint planning meetings and say, I need to understand everything you're doing. Tell me what you're doing because I have my list of needs and I need to know exactly where my stuff fits in. And if you've ever worked with software developers, that approach definitely does not work. They started to feel micromanaged. And then the stakeholder would say, explain it to me like I'm stupid. So of course, the software developers would explain it to him like he was stupid. And then he would leave and go tell leadership, the software development team is very condescending. They're not collaborative. They won't work with me. They won't put my things in. And it became this whole perpetual cycle of meetings of, why can't you just give him what he wants? That's not how it works. Why doesn't it work that way? We have a process, and so on, and back and forth, and very unproductive. And so there was frustration and friction on both sides of the conversation. Additionally, the other largest point of friction we had in the company was software development versus data analytics. At the time, our data was powered by the software developers. They owned it, they housed it, they managed things like Tag Manager, which we had probably 6 months worth of meeting about how to set up a goal. It was ridiculous. And so as we're trying to pull the data, we were reliant on the software team. And the software team really wanted to do things like automation, data cleaning, all the things that make sense when you're working with data. We had probably 200 pages printed out of SPSS syntax. If you're familiar with SPSS, it is an archaic way of analyzing data. And at the time, there was zero automation. It was all manual. We would sit there with a pen and a pencil at the end of every month and fix the code. So needless to say, there was a lot of friction there. And the breakdown in communication was it was distracting, and it would take up a lot of time and resources. And then we had the other never-ending battles of the breakdown in communication. So you had front-end development versus back-end development. Front-end being the UX and the design, back-end being the actual implementation. Never on the same page. You had data versus IT. Data wanted to do certain things, IT wanted to secure the data, we were working with protected health information, and there was just a lack of communication. One of the classics, marketing versus development. Hey, I want to add a new landing page, or I want to add this feature, or this button, or this call to action, and dev says, cool, get in line. Sales versus product. Sales has KPIs. Product doesn't know about them. Product's like, hey, I'm just doing the thing. I'm building the product, I'm getting it out there, and sales is like, great, that's not at all what I thought you were gonna do, so now you're in trouble. Leadership versus product. How many times have your leadership team said, these are the business goals, but then never told you? So the product line is just going forward and they're saying, this is what we think is best, this is what we think that, customers want, and leadership's like, you're not meeting your goals, you're not doing the thing. You have dev versus QA. If you've ever worked with a QA team, they are the most meticulous, detail-oriented folks. If you ever worked with a developer, they're the exact opposite. That is just oil and water waiting to happen, and so on. So how do we fix this? Well, there are ways to fix this, and I want to start by introducing what I call the 5P framework. So this is your purpose, people, process, platform, and performance. Because for the love of God, as marketers, we love alliteration, and we love things that people can remember. And unfortunately, if you stand too close to someone when they talk about these, they might spit on you a little bit, which is good that you're sitting out there. So the first P is purpose. This is your why. This is your what. What is the question you're trying to answer? What is the problem you're trying to solve? Why are we doing this in the first place? Great place to start any conversation. People. Who are involved? In a conversation, you might be thinking, oh, A to B, me and the technologist, me and the smart person. You actually have to factor in who asked the question in the first place, who needs the information. Will I have to communicate this to my audience? Will I have to communicate it to my stakeholders? Will I have to communicate it to the rest of my team, whoever else? Then you have the process, often bundled with platform. This is your how and your when. And so how am I getting this information? What is the frequency? How often do I get this information? How is it being delivered? Is it face-to-face? Is it something that maybe can happen virtually? And then the last P is did we? Did we answer the question being asked? And when you put it all together, you have your purpose and your people and your process. That's setting your expectations for the conversation. When you have your process and your platform, that's your execution of how you're having the conversation. And then you have your measurement. Did we? So here's the thing. That feels like a lot of work just to talk to somebody, and you're absolutely right, it is. The reason I wanted to go through the 5 Ps is because it's really helpful to understand the foundation, because it may not be a one-time conversation. It may be somebody you've never talked to before. It may be somebody with a completely different background or skill set, somebody that you need to get really detailed information from, and it's a struggle. If you think back to the example that I gave in the first few slides when I was talking to Alan, then you know that it may be a difficult task to get useful, productive information out of somebody who has that kind of knowledge of artificial intelligence. So you don't know what questions to ask, and you're frustrated on both sides because they don't know what you're asking, you don't really know what you're asking, you're not getting the answer, and so on and so forth. So once you have the foundation of the 5P framework, you can break it down to even more simple ways of communication. And this is where you can really have effective communications and start to reduce that friction between teams, between different skill sets. This is a user story. So as a persona, I want to so that. It's 3 parts. It's borrowed from Agile methodology, if you're familiar with that. The as a persona is your audience. The want to is your action, and the so that is the intent. When you start to put them all together, you can see that they actually map back to the 5P process, the 5P framework, really nicely. And so each of these components is going to tell you what you need to know and give you the tools to measure the conversation. So as a persona, that's your people. I want to, that's your process and your platform, and your so that, that's your purpose and your performance. So what does this look like? When I was dealing with the team the couple of jobs ago that I had mentioned, I didn't have this skill set at the time. And had I had that skill set, I may have approached it differently, maybe like this. So thinking about that one stakeholder who was always asking the development team, what are you doing? If we had phrased it differently in the context of a user story, it could have been, as a decision maker, I want to understand what development is doing so that I can make informed decisions. Okay, that's helping us set some expectations around why he's continually asking us what's going on. I need to understand. What is the process? Explain it to me. But this doesn't tell us enough of the picture. We need to break it down a level deeper and go into who of our audience he's representing. So there was 2 separate audiences for the product that we were developing. As a clinician, I want to use this software during the intake process of new patients so that I can expedite the process and have more meaningful conversations during our appointment. And then as a patient, I want to use this software during the intake process as a new patient so that I can spend more time talking to my clinician about my issues and not be answering standard questions. So the product that we developed was meant to replace that intake form. It was meant to automate it. Keep in mind, this was 15, 20 years ago, so a lot of the computerized systems that we know today and just expect didn't exist. So at the time, this was quote unquote groundbreaking. And yes, there was floppy disks involved, so it is that old. And so when we start to understand the perspective of the actual audience, we don't have to say things like, tell me like I'm stupid, explain it to me like I'm dumb. We can then point back to these user stories and say, this is why I'm asking. The software has to do this. Help me understand how we can get our software to do the following things so that I can go back to my customers and say, this is what it does. Versus, I didn't understand what you were saying, explain it to me like I'm dumb. 2 very different conversations. If we go back to the development versus data team, we needed to understand why the software development team was really coming so hard for automation with our data analytics team, who, by the way, when I left that company after 11 years, it had still not happened because they were so stubborn about it because there was just no conversation to be had. But in an imaginary world, we could say, as a software developer, I want to automate data processing so that the data team creates less errors. Okay, we're getting somewhere. At the time, it was very siloed and communication was so poor that we didn't realize that the amount of errors that the data team would create with their hand-coded SPSS syntax file would take up so much time from the development team when we did these monthly reports that they could do nothing else. Now, these reports were on a very strict deadline. They were due to pharmaceutical companies, they were due to the FDA, so that had to take precedent. But then you have all the product managers on the other side saying, hey, wait a second, we were on a schedule. I thought that I was gonna get my stuff this week. But first, the development team had to deal with whatever was going on with data. So again, in an imaginary world where these 2 teams would actually talk to each other, we could drill it down a little bit farther to say, as a developer, I want to automate the data processing for the data team so that there are less one-off fixes around the time of reporting, which was a huge time suck. It was a huge cost to all of the different product lines because we were losing time, we were losing development. However, what we didn't realize was, as the data analyst, I want to understand more about automation so that I know the process I use to hand check the data will be replicated. Again, if you've ever worked with a software developer, and this is a generalization, this is not true of all of them, they're terrible at documentation. They're really not great at telling you what it was that they did. They just say, here's the code, it's magic, done, boom. The data analytics team said, that's not good enough. I need to understand that my hand coding is going to be exactly replicated so that I can trust it. So it was a lack of trust is really why this project never got off the ground. But they weren't able to communicate it in that way. And so had they been able to use user stories, they may have said, this is why I don't trust the process. This is the information I'm not able to get from you. The development team may have said, okay, I'm never gonna do documentation, so good luck. It's probably what happened. And then there were the other points of friction in the company that, had we been able to think about using user stories, which again, ironic, we were using them for building out the requirements for the software development team, but we weren't using them for communication. So if we had said, as the back-end developer, I want to be brought into the design process earlier so that I can weigh in on what's possible. 9 times out of 10, what ended up happening is that the front-end development team would work with the creative team, would work with the product teams, would work with the marketing teams, and create these beautiful wireframes and mock-ups, hand it off to the back-end developers, and the back-end developers would say, we don't have time for that, we don't have the technology for that, we don't have the resources for that, we don't have the experience for that. And so basically, we would end up with something that was maybe 20% of what was proposed in the first place, causing additional friction. And so getting that perspective from the back-end development, understanding their intent of why they're pushing back, could have started to ease that. Same with data versus IT. As the IT person, I want to understand the data governance so that I can properly secure the PHI data that we collect. There was a lack of transparency in terms of the governance of how this data was encrypted, how it came into our systems. I can talk about this now, 20 years later, that in the very early days when we were developing this product, clinicians would send me disks of their client data, and I would have 3 different laptops at my computer uploading the data from their disks into our database, totally unsecured. When we brought in the IT person, he said, holy crap, that is unsecure. FDA is going to find out. This is terrible. So, needless to say, with a lack of data governance, he couldn't do his job. And so it was constantly an anxiety that kept him up at night. And we didn't realize that that was really the problem. And then, continuing to go down the line, you have marketing versus dev. As the dev person, I want to understand the marketing strategy so that I can include website features into sprint planning. Okay, that makes sense. Easier said than done. That means you actually have to know what it is that you want to do. And you have to do it in such a way that isn't, I know, generative AI is this new thing, so let's just add it to the website. Let's add a starburst. Let everybody know it's new. That happened quite a few times. You have sales versus product. As the product owner, I want to weigh in on the sales strategy so that I can use those KPIs to inform the product roadmap. You may be seeing a pattern here. The company that I worked for was very siloed. We were only about 60 people, so ironically, nobody talked to anybody. Everybody was very territorial. But I know that that's not unique to the company that I worked for. That is a problem across a lot of companies. And so using user stories can help have those conversations, because what it does is it takes the emotion out of it. It doesn't say, I need this. It doesn't say, you have to do this. You start to frame it in context of your audience, of your customer, of your stakeholders, of other people who may need to weigh in on the conversation, and really help them understand why. Leadership versus product. As the product owner, I want to understand the larger company vision so that I can more thoughtfully inform the product roadmap. Again, having leadership teams who sort of lock down, here's what our goals are, here's what we want to do, is not super helpful. But it's also not something you may have control over. So helping the leadership team understand why you need to know that information, not just because you're nosy, not just because you're like, because I need to know, just tell me. Helping them understand the context, it will inform the product roadmap. You can take it a step further. It will then help us get more customers. It will increase revenue. Having them really understand the why will help you have that conversation. And then you have dev versus QA. As the QA person, I want dev to create more thorough requirements so that I know what product support is supposed to do. QA can't test without requirements. Dev won't create requirements. What are you going to do? And so there are obviously tools that can help with that, but this is the core reason why those two teams are often at odds. So why the 5P framework and user stories? Well, one of the reasons is because managing people is difficult. It's really hard. People are hard. People are unpredictable. When you take the emotion out of it, when you say, I need to understand this as the customer, I need to understand the release notes of the product so that I can properly, update my systems, that I can update our internal teams. You're no longer saying, I need to know this because I just do, or because I think you're doing it wrong, or because I'm not smart enough to understand you. Those are all the reasons why those conversations fail. And the reason why I focus so hard on having those conversations is because despite what some people sitting in the front row might say, people are still on either side of the conversation. You may have technology sitting squarely in between you and the other person, but there's still two people. If you're interacting with a system like ChatGPT, you're not talking to a person. You're not going to get that feedback. You're not going to be told, I don't like your tone, is something wrong with you today? They're going to be fairly predictable, whereas people are predictably unpredictable. Someone may be having a bad day, having a bad morning. You may not know what's going on with them, but you still have to deal with them. You still need to get information from them. And again, systems like, I'm not anti-AI, systems like ChatGPT, internet searches, they're not customized to your business. So if you have that conversation of how do we need to use generative AI in our marketing strategy, you're not going to be able to source that from a technology system. So the 5P framework and user stories help you organize your thoughts. They help you set expectations for yourself and the other person. They help you verify if the outcome aligns with the question being asked. And they help you cut down on distractions. If you ever talk to someone who takes 3 hours to tell a story, answer a question, you know that you're sort of sitting there like, okay, this is really cool, but like, can we get to the point? Using a user story can help you do that. So remember this guy? So when I was thinking about it, I was like, I really left that original conversation not feeling that great. I was like, this doesn't feel good. He didn't answer my question. So let me see what I can do with this. Maybe I'll use a user story. So I said, hey, resident smart person, I think we need to talk about this. We need to resolve our issues. I have a question and you need to answer it. So instead, I said this. I said, as an underling doing the bidding of the CMO, I want to understand the use cases of generative AI so that I can tell my overlord if there are any applications to consider. This is really what my CMO was trying to get to, was not tell me what generative AI is. What my CMO was trying to understand was, how do we use it? What do we need to know about it so that we can factor it in to our plans? When I positioned it like this, my resident smart person said, oh, now I know what you're asking. Let me go ahead. Here are the 6 classifications of use cases of generative AI. They are generation, extraction, summarization, rewriting, classification, and question answering. And then we had this very long, detailed conversation about the different use cases of generative AI and how they apply to our business specifically and the things that we're doing and how we could factor that into our overall marketing strategy for the next upcoming year, which is way better. And the reason it's way better is because it's productive and it's useful and it's informative and it's tactical. And so I left that conversation saying, you know what? He's not such a bad guy. And we all lived happily ever after. And so what I want you to take away, if nothing else, is that we all know managing people is hard. Technology is only going to make that harder because our skill sets are going to get farther and farther away from each other. People skills are the things that we are going to let go first. So you need to practice them. You need to have productive conversations. We only have so many hours in the day to work with our coworkers, and we don't want to spend it trying to have these conversations saying, I don't get it. What do you need? I don't understand. I feel dumb. We don't have time for that. Things are moving too quickly to be able to do that. So you need to be able to have productive conversations quickly and efficiently and get to the answers that you need. And so with that, I would say, if you want to download our free ebook on those 6 categories of classifications of use cases of generative AI, this is where you can do that.
All right, thank you, Katie. Give a round of applause. I'm coming up here not to be awkward, but so I can be in the screen for Q&A real quick.
I mean, it is a little awkward, but I'm okay with that.
Right here.
It's okay.
Are there any questions from the online folks first? Okay. Then any questions from the people up here? And I'm going to run to you with a microphone. This is my exercise for the day, so please.
Please make him do it.
Coming in. Brooke, speaker later today, 5 o'clock this room.
Okay, so what if you are many of those departments, and then someone else is like the other half of all of those departments, and maybe you also might be married to each other. And so how do you address, is it still using the framework? Because it feels a lot like counseling.
So the question is, what if you are wearing many hats and the person on the other side of the conversation is also wearing many hats? How do you have that conversation? Because a lot of what I just shared feels like counseling. And people management, quite honestly, if I'm being honest, is a lot like counseling because we're trying to get information, we're trying to do it professionally, we're trying to do it in a certain way. And a user story helps you have that conversation, again, without having the emotion of, well, yesterday you said this, and today you're going to say this, and I don't understand this. And it keeps you focused on the conversation. So if the conversation is, we need to increase sales, what you would do in that instance is say, as the sales rep, as the marketing person, as the intern who's creating the graphic designs, because every single person has a part in helping you reach that goal, but every single person is going to play a different part and have different needs. And so the user stories help you understand what those needs are, what their perspective is, and so they can say, okay, this is where I now fit into this overall goal. I now have a sense of ownership over it. And so that way you can then you can also use it to track back measurement. Did the intern create the thing that helps us reach the goal? Did the salesperson do the thing that helps us reach the goal? And it helps you have that conversation from all those different perspectives. So it's not enough to just say, you know, as the owner of the company, I want to increase sales so that I have more money. It doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't give you the information you need in order to do that effectively. So then you start to break it down by role and say, as the salesperson, I need more marketing qualified leads from our marketing team so that I can close more deals. Marketing says, I need more traffic to our website so that I can create more marketing qualified leads so that I can then close more sales. So the purpose and the performance are always the same. It's the process, it's the platform, and it's the roles, the people that are going to change throughout each of those user stories. And that's how I would recommend, not being a therapist, but that's how I'd recommend having that conversation, because you're no longer saying, we just need to make more money. It doesn't mean anything to anyone.
Any other questions? Therapy questions, even, possibly. Yep.
Have you ever been on a scenario where the key framework just doesn't work? Like, is there like another like last resort you could use? Like, I don't know, inviting a beer to those guys or something like that?
So the question,
Or is there like another?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, has there ever been a scenario where the framework doesn't work? Absolutely. It's not a perfect framework. It's something that I would recommend. It's an iterative thing. As you learn more, you're going to evolve it. It's not something that, like requirements, you don't set it in stone. You say, this is a living, breathing thing. Now, in that instance, you know, to the other half of the question, maybe it is easier to just buy the person a beer and say, hey, what's going on? Why can't we like figure this out? But it really comes down to understanding that other person and reading people, understanding people. That's a whole separate skill set that I would love to have time to get into. But within the constraint of this session, I wanted to give you at least a starting point of a foundation. And I've always found user stories to be really effective. And so, great example of that. And I do pick on Chris. Chris is my co-founder at Trust Insights, and he gave me permission to pick on him. He and I struggle to communicate a lot of the time because he's moving so quickly with AI and automation and product development that he'll say, I did this thing. And I will say, I don't know what that is. But that's not a productive conversation for us to have. We have a lot of other things going on. So I have to put it in context of, help me understand how our audience would use this. Help me understand how I would use this. What's the so what of this thing? And then it asks, basically what I'm asking him to do is create that user story of, as the end user, I want to curate a Spotify list so that I can have, you know, tailored music for any given opportunity. My challenge to him is to frame it in a user story that helps me understand why this thing should see the light of day. It slows the other person down a little bit to help them think through what it is they want to do and think of it from the perspective, not just their perspective, but from the perspective of someone who might actually use it besides them.
Welcome back here. Other questions? Comments? Anything else from online? All right. Like, we're going to wrap a little bit early then. Yeah, do it for Katie one more time. Thanks.